As we come, our sermon time this morning is a little bit different. A couple of times a year now, Sal and I just have a conversation about things we like to talk about. And that is our message to you. And so we're going to do that this morning. And our topic for this morning is about being spiritual versus being religious. As I said, if you saw the Messenger article, there are people, lots of people call themselves spiritual but not religious. There are people who consider themselves both, or think that's one and the same. But there's also a new category that Pew Research has been tracking of people who consider themselves religious but not spiritual. So what's the distinction, and how do we think about that? And in recent years, there has actually been science done about all of that. So I'm going to be quoting during our discussion from two books by Dr. Lisa Miller, who's an American tenured professor at Columbia University Teachers College in the clinical psychology program. She's also founder of the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute. I have her two books written for a popular audience. She also has a textbook, which I haven't read because it's $155. But her first book for a general audience was The Spiritual Child, The New Science on Parenting for Health and Lifelong Thriving. Came out in 2015. The second is The Awakened Brain, The New Science of Spirituality and Our Quest for an Inspired Life. Came out in 2021. This isn't the first time I've talked about Dr. Miller's work, although it's been a while. There was only this one in print when I first mentioned it. I doubt it will be the last time that you hear from me about this topic. Since this is a very science-aware congregation, I want to make sure you understand that her work and her findings are all peer-reviewed studies in an area that very few have found worthy of study until very recently: spirituality and religion and their impact on the rest of human life and flourishing. Sal and I are going to be talking about that topic relating to our own experiences and calling. We're talking about calling across this year. And as we go, we'll be pulling from Dr. Miller's findings to make our points. Or at least I will, sometimes. But the most important things to understand before we begin are twofold. First, Dr. Miller's findings show that spirituality and religion often go together, but they are not at all the same thing. And it's the spirituality piece that conveys all the mental and physical health benefits that they have found in their research, irrespective of whether that spirituality has any form of religious expression. A quote I pulled about that related to her studies of adolescence comes from The Spiritual Child, page 43. Quote, "Our published findings show that an adolescent with a strong personal relationship with a higher power, compared to an adolescent without this inner source of spirituality, is 70 to 80% less likely to engage in heavy substance use or substance abuse. There was no protectiveness at all related to the intensity of adherence to the family religious tradition." Close quote. The second thing to kick us off is the definition of spirituality that emerged from her studies and those of others. It's hinted at in what I just quoted and appears in the same book, Spiritual Child, on page 25. Quote, "Spirituality is an inner sense of relationship to a higher power that is loving and guiding. The word we give to this higher power might be God, nature, spirit, the universe, the creator, or other words that represent a divine presence. But the important point is that spirituality encompasses our relationship and dialogue with this higher presence." Close quote. She says on page 24 that spirituality is, quote, the only thing that science has shown to reliably predict fulfillment, success, and thriving is a child's spiritual development. And one more quote. This one from the other book, The Awakened Brain. She's quoting Dr. David Schaffer, chair of Columbia's Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, who said the following in a lecture. I never would have considered that religion or spirituality might be significant to psychiatry, he said, until I was studying child and adolescent suicide and discovered a surprising glimmer in the data. Our rather large school-based screening for psychopathology found that it's very difficult to identify protective factors against suicide. There was no single variable that tells us who will or won't show suicidality except for one. Strong personal spirituality was the only variable inversely associated with suicide. Our conversation this morning is a life and death conversation. Come on up, Sal.
No pressure.
You want to do the light? And I have my timer so that you can go and have lunch this afternoon and we don't just talk forever on this. Yeah.
Could you have Sal introduce himself so people on the live stream know who he is? Is that bad?
Sure.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sal Caraviello. First, a big thank you. Thank you to Anne. Thank you to all of you. I love being here. Thank you for allowing me to rent space upstairs and to do things like this and be part of your community. You're a blessing to me. I just wanted to thank you. Even I was going to do that without giving the introduction, but thank you. Thank you. Is that
Yes.
enough? You want more?
I just wanted to know, you're a spiritual counselor, psychologist, I think they'd like to know.
Oh, good. So I'm a spiritual counselor, and I have to be careful. I can't use the word therapist, so I just can say I'm a counselor.
Yes, and that's your degree, right?
That's a long story. That'll be another conversation.
Yes, but we are very grateful to have you here. And when it comes to the blend of spirituality and religion, Sal and I have different experiences with that. So that's kind of the place I want to start. In my life, spirituality was twinned with a religious upbringing in a Baptist church from infancy. So it took me a long time to sort of recognize that there were two different things going on because, from the minute I could breathe, both of them were in my life and seen as one. But Sal's experience of that was different. So I want to start by having you just tell us about how you experienced the difference between those things and when you became aware of them. And
Great. Thank you. So I grew up here. I grew up in Burlington, Mass, so not far from here. And I born and baptized Catholic. But what happened in my family is my mom and dad got divorced when I was 5 in 1970. And at that time, sort of the official doctrine of the church was that divorced people brought scandal to the church. Not that maybe they were going through something hard and they might need the support of the church. It was really the opposite. There was like an exclusion. And so we were still Catholic, but at that point, you're only 5 years old, so you're not getting, say, a formal Catholic education. My mom had custody, so it was my mom, and she had 4 kids and had to work full time, but faith was important. So the faith and the belief in God and prayers, but that formal thing, a lot of people, when I first got to St. Mary's, the assumption was, oh, that's Sal, he probably was an altar server and played CYO basketball and went on retreats. Nothing, right? So I didn't have any of those formal experiences in the church. I didn't know Father Flanagan. You know, there was none of that in my upbringing, but this, I will say, so in terms of spirituality, a dividing, and not a dividing point, but really a metanoia of sorts for me. I was very, very young, maybe 7 or 8, somewhere in that age range. And, you know, when your parents get divorced, it leaves a mark, right? Because they love each other, or they're supposed to. When that breaks, even though a child can't put words to it, you start finding out you're searching for a level of permanence, or I did. So you end up searching for a permanence, and in that short period, my 28-year-old uncle died of cancer, my grandmother had a heart attack, and my house burned down. So all these things of permanence were, you know, hanging in the balance in my young age, and I couldn't interpret all of this, but you feel it. So at a very young age, I started asking myself the question, what lasts? And everything I came up with ended. But the only thing that never ended was God. And so separating sort of religion from spirituality, my spiritual nature was, well, this God of love, is the only thing that lasts. So that became sort of my spiritual pursuit that was maybe subtly augmented by religion, but really a personal quest of spirituality. And that happened at a very, very young age for me. Does that start to explain it, I think?
Yeah. And so then do you connected that to your religion at some point, or were they always sort of separate?
That's a great question. I think, again, that I'm Catholic, so there was, I'll say almost through osmosis, always connecting it. So one of my best friends here, Steve Webb's in the front row, and I can remember he and I as, you know, teenagers, you know, if people slept over my house, we'd be leading the charge that we have to go to Mass in the morning, you know, and the idea that also, that place was a place of it, even though I didn't have a entrenched relationship with the hierarchical church, having church and knowing that your religion was part of your spirituality was still there, even though I didn't have much of a formal relationship with it. So going to church on Sunday, I wasn't forced to go, and I wasn't forced to go to religious ed classes, but I did, because it felt like it was happening there, you know, in a more concrete way. Yeah, and in my growing up, things were very my adult life has not been permanent at all in any way, but my childhood life was totally same house, parents stayed together, and my mother was the real spiritual force. And even though, you know, I don't remember a time when I wasn't, you know, from infancy onward going to church on a Sunday morning, it was, I think, my spirituality part, that building a personal relationship with something higher and outside of myself was something really that happened at home before it got connected to what was going on in church. And it got connected at home in a couple of ways, all through my mother. You know, my mother would sing me hymns at bedtime and the Chiquita Banana song, so it may explain why my brain is the way it is. But I had that, and because she loved
the outdoors and the natural world. And I grew up in this beautiful yard set out in Rhode Island, in rural Rhode Island, just woods on 3 sides of it. I remember she always sang, "This is my father's world," and it's always been a special song for me. But we would apply that, in going outside and learning to have relationships, I think first with just other species outside, when you're thinking about having a relationship with something outside of yourself. So we always had pets. We had turtles and hamsters and cats and dogs and even a skunk once named Petunia. But there were the wild animals outside, and the woodchucks and the raccoons and the birds. My grandmother fed paper wasps on her finger, sugar water. And being taught from a very young age that I could have a relationship with a creature, a thing that was not human, a wild animal, a bird, a tree, was a stepping stone. And I think also my father he didn't get the spirituality part until a year before he died. But he did love fantasy literature. And he read me, from a very young age, he would read to me, Adventures of a Brownie and even the pre-Lord of the Rings kinds of things. He had me convinced that in the backyard there was a bush which was where the fairies lived. So, and as I came to realize, fairies probably didn't live there, but there was always that probably, maybe. And I think somehow in my brain, even something as simple as fantasy kind of literature and reading prepped my brain that there were things perhaps happening that I couldn't see. There were things going on in the world that were not immediately obvious. And that too, I think, was important. And then, of course, at home, my mother was reading, I had a children's Bible. She would read stories from that well before I ever got them in Sunday school or any of that. And so there built this bridge from, I can have relationships with creatures that are not human, and maybe there are even creatures that I can't see. There are, more things in this world than are dreamt of in your philosophy. And that made it possible, I think, for me to quickly, when my mother could then substitute in, well, there's Jesus and God. And there was artwork in the sanctuary. It was, I learned later, bad art. But someone in the congregation had painted these big paintings, and so they kind of had to put them up because somebody in the congregation did it, and it was really terrible. But they were up there, and near our family pew, there was this big picture of Jesus in the clouds, and your typical white Jesus in the clouds with a shepherd's crook, but a hand out. And I would sit through church, and I didn't understand what was being talked about in the sermon, and the imagination that had been nurtured in me as a child took to that bad art Jesus on the wall, and we would sort of go on adventures in my mind during church. And I'd imagine him there were other pictures of Jesus healing the sick and doing other things, and so I sort of imposed that on our little adventures. But it was building a relationship. It was another step in building my own personal relationship with this Jesus guy who was embodied or graphically depicted there in the picture. And when at 14 years old, I was preaching my very first sermon for Youth Sunday, my sermon was in telling people about my adventures with the bad art Jesus on the wall. And it was at that time, at 14, that I felt standing there in the pulpit that this was the thing that God meant me to do for the rest of my life. Because I learned in my personal relationship with Jesus and through my parents that God was love and that God loved everyone there. And that was my experience, and that I was to pass that on. And that sort of relates to the data in the Spiritual Child, pages 68 through 69. A study of over 1,000 people from ages 14 to 25 showed that age range to be the largest surge of spiritual awakening. There's a big one when kids are like Aiden's age and toddlers. Hi, Aiden. But the big kahuna is there between 14 and 25, when so much else is changing in life. And she goes on to say on page 71, what we found was clear. Adolescents are profoundly spiritual. They are experiencing spiritual stirrings as the momentous and wondrous. And they are surprised that for the most part, nobody has talked to them about this experience. Nobody, even people they love dearly, have asked or commented or said something to make spiritual development part of a conversation. Shared words that would make their inner life a spoken reality. And go.
No, you take your time. I'm good.
Yeah, because that, I think when we get into the church, there's a sense, especially with children, that there's a sense that the church, get them into Sunday school, get them into your CDC training, that the church is going to take care of all of that spiritual development and growth. And that's, at least in my experience, kind of hit or miss. But it's not something that you need to be trained for. You do not need to know the Bible to be able to have a spiritual conversation with a child, to be able to introduce anyone at any age to the concept that the world may be bigger than we know. I mean, physics is, I spent 10 years married to a physicist. There's all kinds of stuff we don't know. If we took a microscope and looked at the pews we're sitting on through a microscope and saw that everything was actually moving around, you'd never sit down. You'd think, I can't sit on that. That's not a solid thing. Everything is moving. We can't see that. With the right instruments, you can see it a little bit better. But that the knowledge that maybe, just maybe, the fact that we can't yet see it doesn't mean it's not there. And just bringing up the question, which sort of relates to Thomas a little bit in the reading from this morning. How much are we willing to say, maybe I don't know everything. Maybe there are things that are experienced in other ways. I don't know, do you have, and you can run in a different direction if you want to.
No, and I'll jump on that point. And you know, one of the beautiful things about this walk, and I think, I don't want to speak for everyone, but for myself in terms of faith and spirituality, is the vastness of God. And even if I use this example, if God is the Pacific Ocean, I'm not even a tiny drop in that, right? So I'm not looking for false humility when I say that undervalues God and it overvalues me. Back to this idea of how vast God is, and in my tiny walk on this planet, how little I can really know of God. So the humility of that and the beauty of God is so far beyond my capabilities. And I'm going to now segue it to our kids. I think, not what I think, what I've observed over the last 30 years from the scientific mental health field around adolescence is criminal. We have so reduced our children to a mental illness, and I've spent more time with young people than anyone on this planet, and I am not seeing what is being said about them from the scientific mental health field. It is criminal, it has contributed to their deaths, and no one ever gets in trouble, because it has reduced them to this mental illness, and then we, the adult population, lead from that. You're ADHD, you're ADD, you're bipolar. Really? When you're 12 and you're hearing that, that becomes your reality. You don't have enough reality to fight against it. And I am not seeing that. I am seeing beautiful spiritual children who, as you said, are not having an opportunity to express where they are. They are just being told by a clinical team that they are broken and damaged, and they are damaged for life. It doesn't come across that way. We use cute ways to say it. But the truth is, has the adult population say, what are your thoughts about God? What are your thoughts about an afterlife? What are your thoughts about, what are your favorite, where would you like to go if money were no issue? Open-ended questions that allow them the breadth of experience. And when we start to diminish them, and we start to diminish, like you would use that quote from the professor at Columbia, said, I never thought that there was a connection between spirituality and psychology. I will say, how delinquent in your behavior? Really? Is this where we are in terms of accessing spirituality for our kids? And if we don't give them a platform to express their hearts and their souls, how are they going to express their hearts and their souls? And so the idea, I'm going to separate that into two camps. The first one just being the vast beauty of our emotions. They're all there for a reason. Your anger, your frustration, your depression, your sadness, your terror, your joy, your peacefulness, your happiness, they're all part of the construct. And when we don't allow our young people the breadth of that experience, and then label every difficult emotion, not bad, as a mental illness, how do they get to feel themselves? And if they're never having the opportunity to express spiritually where they are, except in their own heads, how does these things come together to create a full person when they're disallowed societally, and they are absolutely, abjectly disallowed in the mental health field? And so a child can only speak to a doctor through the prism of, yes, I agree, I'm damaged. Oh, how do you survive that? And now we have 250,000 to 300,000 deaths of despair every year, mostly in young people. Who's responsible for that? Not the young person. This has been where we have become so abjectly terrified in this society to speak to anything outside of, we can put it on a matrix and prove it. And if you can't, then we can't even speak about it. So the overreach of again, back to the God thing and spirituality, the overreach, I love science, but what we're doing in science is not science. It's voodoo, and it's not working. Sorry.
And I'm going to read a few more quotes, and then the day is going to come to an end. Specifically on depression, because the statistics are really amazing. This is from The Awakened Brain, page 52. Even when I added in all the variables that mainstream clinical science has shown are linked to childhood depression, mother's depression, poverty, a stormy home environment, overly cold or controlling parenting, I found that intergenerational transmission of spirituality, which is basically parents or grandparents talking to their children about spiritual experiences, or just thoughts, conversations. Intergenerational transmission of spirituality had the same astounding 80% protective benefit against depression. It was the largest protective effect I'd seen anywhere in the resilience literature. And then from The Awakened Brain, this is specifically on kids were more likely to find in Winchester and other privileged areas. The Awakened Brain, pages 138 to 9, Dr. Sunia Luthar, professor of psychology at Columbia, studying affluent suburban comparison groups for her urban youth studies on depression, found that the privileged or rich kids were doing markedly worse in several measures than their less affluent peers. They had much higher rates of substance abuse, depression, and anxiety, and despite having resources and physical safety, felt more vulnerable and fearful. So Dr. Luther worked with Dr. Miller to add spirituality to her study, and, quote, found that among the affluent youth, the rate of spirituality was significantly lower than in the population at large. Only 15% of the kids from highly resourced suburbs reported that they had a personal spiritual identity or practice, a rate of spirituality less than 1/4 the national rate published in Pew and Gallup polls. They also found that the 85% of the sample who were not spiritual had over 10-fold the national rate of risk for sociopathy. Now, the good news, a couple of quotes to say you can do this. These are all quotes from Spiritual Child. Page 6, natural spirituality, in fact, appears to be the single most significant factor in children's health and their ability to thrive. Page 91, in a series of studies spanning 2 decades at the College of William and Mary, they found that children literally take the attributes of their parents and stamp them on the faces of their higher power. So the way we react, we imagine God first as our parents. Page 101. The essential developmental support that parents are uniquely positioned to provide includes early exposure, awareness, and cultivation of our spiritual assets, time and space, nature, a vocabulary, and a spiritual social context. Just loving your child openly and honestly helps develop their natural spirituality. Because they experience transcendence through the same apparatus through which they experience your love, your unconditional affection is a big step in the right direction. And it comes back to what I've preached on time and time again. It's all about love. And the love of God comes through us to each other. And when we love another person, a quote I love from Les Mis, to love another person is to see the face of God. That is true for all of us. It is true for, especially for our children. To give someone the gift of unconditional love is to give them Spirit. It's to breathe the Holy Spirit into them. And then to have a way to talk about it. Not to be afraid of it. Often parents are afraid to have spiritual discussions because I'm not going to know the answers to the questions. Well, guess what? I don't have the answers to the questions. Being able to have a vocabulary to talk about it is the important thing. It's a real experience. And for anybody between 14 and 25, especially, have that conversation. Anything you want to?
Sure. I'll say you probably picked up on my frustration, here in a beautiful setting, then my guilt comes in. I'm like, oh, I need to soften that, But I'll say that this comes from 40 years, day in and day out, of working with young people, as youth minister, as teacher, and now in my counseling practice. And on this beautiful end, in this season of resurrection, what we've missed is not you specifically, but I think culturally is how beautiful and how unique and how amazing our kids are in their own right. And every child and young person who's ever talked to me, I have not seen what's been said of them. I have not seen that mental illness. What I've seen is different developmental points that are often going unmet, and then they're struggling. Not because they're mentally ill, they're struggling because that moment of challenge they're navigating by themselves. And I look and I go, once I'm talking to a child and they're explaining their life to me, I go, makes perfect sense. And they'll often say, so you don't think I'm sick? No, I think that your reaction to what you've experienced makes perfect sense. And now what we're going to work on is having having more agency around your experiences, and this becomes and I'll end with this, the basic belief for me is you are a child of God and you were born very good, because that's what God said about you. Not perfect, but very good, and that you were born with purpose and meaning. And I don't even ever have to say that in a session with anyone, but that's what I carry in with me. So most everything else has been what has happened, and then we can work on the environment. But you yourself, the child, is born very good with meaning and purpose. And that has been, hearing kids speak over these 40 years has been absolutely profound. And I often find their stories are not being told. And we've all been there. But it's only a short period of time, because we all come from that. But the stories of our kids and who they are and how they feel and how magnificent they are is not, especially the last 30 years, is not getting out there. That's what I'll end on.
Amen. Amen. And thank you. We will, I'm sure, talk again.
Thank you.